Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore how to survive Victorian London during the 19th century. This is going to be an extremely detailed, methodical examination of the daily challenges, hazards, and survival strategies necessary to live in one of history's most crowded and dangerous cities that will hopefully help you drift off to sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare for a long, thorough, and decidedly boring journey through Victorian London survival. Boring history for sleep, how to survive Victorian London. Chapter 1. Finding accommodation in Victorian London. To survive Victorian London, the first and most essential requirement was securing adequate accommodation. This was far more challenging than it might seem, as housing shortages, poverty, and exploitative landlords made finding a safe, affordable place to live extremely difficult for most residents. Let us examine in exhaustive detail the process of finding and maintaining housing in Victorian London. The Victorian period, which spanned from 1837 to 1901 during the reign of Queen Victoria, saw London's population grow from approximately 2 million to over 6 million people. This explosive growth occurred faster than housing could be built, creating chronic shortages and driving many people into overcrowded, substandard living conditions. Understanding this context is essential before we examine specific survival strategies. For someone newly arrived in Victorian London with limited financial resources, which describes most migrants from rural areas or from other countries, the first challenge would be finding any accommodation at all. The options available depended entirely on how much money one had. Let us begin with the cheapest options and work our way up through the housing hierarchy. The absolute cheapest accommodation was a spot in a common lodging house, sometimes called a doss house. These establishments existed throughout London but were concentrated in poor neighbourhoods including the East End, Seven Dials, and areas south of the Thames. A common lodging house would be a building, often a converted house or warehouse, where landlords crammed as many people as possible into every available space to maximize profit. For 4p per night, which was the typical price, though it could range from 3p to 6p, a lodger would receive a bed in a dormitory room shared with many other people. The beds would be arranged close together, perhaps only a foot or two apart, with little privacy or personal space. The bed itself would consist of a wooden or iron frame with a thin mattress stuffed with straw, horsehair, or flock, which was shredded fabric. The mattress would be lumpy, would smell unpleasant from years of use by countless previous occupants, and would be infested with bedbugs and fleas that would bite throughout the night. The bedding provided would be minimal, perhaps a single rough blanket that would be inadequate for warmth in London's cold, damp winters. Lodgers might sleep in their clothes for warmth, and to prevent their clothing from being stolen, as theft was common in these establishments. The pillow, if one was provided, would be a sack stuffed with straw or rags, offering minimal comfort. The dormitory rooms would be poorly ventilated, with small windows that might be kept closed to prevent drafts, resulting in air that was hot, stuffy, and foul-smelling from the exhalations and body odors of perhaps 20 or 30 people crowded into a space designed for far fewer. The smell would be a mixture of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, cheap alcohol, chamber pots that were not emptied frequently enough, and the general mustiness of a building with poor maintenance. The noise in common lodging houses would make sleep difficult. People would come and go at all hours, as many lodgers worked night shifts or irregular hours. There would be snoring, coughing, conversations, arguments, and sometimes violence. The thin walls and floors meant that noise from other rooms and from the street would be clearly audible. A light sleeper would find these conditions nearly intolerable, but exhaustion from long working hours would eventually overcome discomfort. The rules in common lodging houses were minimal but strictly enforced. Payment was required in advance, and anyone who could not pay would be turned out onto the street immediately, regardless of the weather or the time of night. No credit was given, no exceptions were made. This meant that a person who had a bad day at work and failed to earn enough for lodging would spend that night on the streets, exposed to cold, rain, and danger. Many common lodging houses had kitchens where lodgers could prepare food if they had any, or could purchase simple meals from the lodging house keeper at inflated prices. The kitchen would have a stove or fireplace where lodgers could cook, along with basic utensils that would be shared among all residents. The hygiene in these kitchens would be appalling, with food scraps, grease, and dirt accumulating in corners and with minimal cleaning. For those who could not afford even the 4p for a bed in a dormitory, there were even cheaper options. For 2p, a person could rent a place on a rope for the night. This involved a rope stretched across a room at chest height, over which exhausted workers would lean to sleep standing up or stooped over. When morning came, the rope would be cut or released, dumping the sleepers onto the floor as a wake-up call. This dehumanizing arrangement shows the desperation of the poorest Londoners and the ruthlessness of those who profited from that desperation. For a penny, one might gain access to a warm room where they could sit for the night, but not lie down. These penny sits were marginally better than sleeping on the streets, but offered no real rest. People would doze sitting upright in chairs or on benches, waking constantly from discomfort and from the cold when the fire burned low. For those with slightly more money, perhaps sixpence to a shilling per night, a private room in a lodging house or in a boarding house might be affordable. These rooms would still be small and basic, perhaps 10 feet by 8 feet, with a narrow bed, a small table, a chair, and perhaps a washstand with a basin and pitcher. The room would likely have a single small window, thin walls through which neighbors could be heard clearly, and minimal furnishings. The advantages of a private room were significant compared to dormitory living. There would be privacy, security for one's belongings, the ability to maintain cleanliness according to one's own standards, and relief from the constant proximity of strangers. However, even private rooms in poor neighborhoods would have problems, including damp walls, inadequate heating, pest infestations, and landlords who neglected repairs and maintenance. For working-class families, renting rooms in tenement buildings was the standard arrangement. A family might rent 1 or 2 rooms in a building, divided into many separate dwellings. The bought rent might be 3 to 8 shillings per week depending on the size and location. These rooms would serve as bedroom, living room, and kitchen all in one, with the entire family sleeping, eating, and living in extremely close quarters. The tenement buildings where working-class families lived were typically old structures that had been built for single-family occupation, but had been subdivided to house multiple families. The buildings would be poorly maintained by landlords who extracted maximum rent while spending minimal amounts on upkeep. The result would be buildings with leaking roofs, damp walls, broken windows, inadequate sanitation, and general deterioration. The process of securing accommodation required having references or knowing someone who could vouch for you, having money for advance rent and deposits, and being able to convince the landlord or lodging housekeeper that you could reliably pay. For new arrivals in London, with no connections and limited funds, this process could be extremely difficult, and many would spend their first nights sleeping rough on the streets or in doorways until they could save enough from whatever work they found to afford lodging. The constant threat of eviction hung over poor Londoners, as missing even one payment could result in immediate expulsion. Families would be put out on the street with their belongings, which might then be lost to thieves or to weather. The fear of eviction would drive people to desperate measures to earn money, including crime, prostitution, or accepting dangerous work for minimal pay. For those who could afford better accommodation, the middle classes might rent houses or flats in more respectable neighborhoods, including Bloomsbury, Kensington, or suburbs like Clapham. The rent for a middle-class house might be £40 to £100 per year or more, far beyond the reach of working-class families. These houses would have multiple rooms, would be better maintained, and would be in neighborhoods with better sanitation and fewer obvious hazards. The wealthy, of course, owned or rented grand houses in fashionable areas, including Mayfair, Belgravia, and other West End neighborhoods. Their housing concerns were entirely different and related to status and fashion, rather than to basic survival. For our purposes focused on survival for ordinary people, we will not dwell on upper-class housing, except to thumbnail. Note that it existed in stark contrast to the conditions endured by the majority of Londoners. Understanding the housing market and securing adequate accommodation was the first essential step in surviving Victorian London. Without a place to sleep, to store belongings, and to shelter from weather, survival would be precarious at best. The strategies for finding and keeping accommodation involved having steady income, understanding which neighborhoods offered the best value, developing relationships with landlords or lodging housekeepers, and being prepared to move frequently as circumstances changed. Chapter 2. Finding employment and earning a living. Having secured some form of accommodation, the next survival requirement in Victorian London was finding employment to generate income for rent, food, and other necessities. The Victorian economy offered numerous employment opportunities, but many were poorly paid, dangerous, or unreliable. Let us examine the job market and employment strategies in exhaustive detail. The range of occupations available in Victorian London was enormous, reflecting the city's role as the commercial and industrial centre of the British Empire. The challenge was not finding work, but finding work that paid adequately and reliably. For newly arrived migrants or for people with limited skills, the options were generally limited to unskilled labor, which paid the least and offered the least security. For men, common unskilled jobs included dock labor, where workers would load and unload ships in the Port of London. Dock work was brutally hard physical labor requiring strength and endurance. Workers would carry heavy loads on their backs, would work in all-weather conditions, and would be exposed to injuries from falling cargo, from accidents with equipment, and from fights with other workers competing for jobs. The work was casual, meaning workers were hired by the day or even by the hour, with no guarantee of steady employment. The hiring process for dock work was degrading and chaotic. Each morning, hundreds or thousands of men would gather at dock gates hoping to be selected for work. The foremen would choose which workers to hire based on favoritism, on bribes, or simply on which men could push their way to the front of the crowd. Those not selected would have no income for that day and would return the next morning to try again. This system created desperate competition and left many men unemployed for days at a time. The pay for dock work when one was selected might be 4p to 6p per hour, meaning a full day's work of perhaps 10 to 12 hours would earn 4 to 6 shillings. This was barely enough to survive on, particularly given that work was not available every day. A dock worker might average only 3 or 4 days of work per week, leaving income inadequate for family support. Other unskilled labor jobs for men included working as general laborers on construction sites, as street sweepers employed by parishes to keep streets clean, as porters carrying goods at markets and railway stations, as costermongers selling fruits and vegetables from barrows in the streets, and various other manual jobs. All of these occupations shared characteristics of low pay, irregular work, and harsh conditions. For women, employment options were even more limited and generally paid less than comparable work done by men. Domestic service was the largest employer of women in Victorian London, with hundreds of thousands of women and girls working as maids, cooks, housekeepers, and other servants in middle-class and upper-class households. Domestic service offered several advantages, including housing and food provided by employers, which meant servants did not pay rent or worry about daily meals. The work was hard and the hours were long, typically from early morning until late evening, with perhaps one afternoon off per week, but it was relatively secure compared to other options. The pay for domestic servants varied by position and by the wealth of the employing household, but a young maid might earn 10 to 20 pounds per year plus room and board. More senior positions, including housekeepers or cooks in wealthy households, might earn 40 to 60 pounds per year. While these wages seem small, when combined with free accommodation and food, they represented reasonable value for working-class women. However, domestic service had significant disadvantages. Servants lived in their employers' houses and were under constant supervision and control. They had little freedom, little privacy, and were subject to dismissal for infractions of rules or simply if the employer decided they were no longer wanted. Sexual harassment and abuse of female servants by male employers or by male members of households was common, and servants who became pregnant would be dismissed immediately with no recourse or support. Women who did not enter domestic service might find work in the numerous factories and workshops of London, including clothing manufacturers where they would sew garments, match factories where they would make matches, food processing facilities, and various other industrial operations. Factory work typically paid more than domestic service, perhaps 10 to 15 shillings per week, for a full-time worker, but it lacked the housing and food benefits of domestic service and often involved dangerous conditions. The match factories were particularly notorious for causing phossy jaw, a horrible disease caused by exposure to white phosphorus used in match manufacturing. The disease would cause the jawbone to decay and would be extremely painful and often fatal. Workers knew the risks but took the jobs because they needed income and had few alternatives. Women might also work as laundresses, taking in washing and ironing from middle-class households. This work could be done at home, allowing women to care for children while working, but it was extremely physically demanding. Laundresses would spend hours hauling heavy wet linens, scrubbing clothes on washboards, heating water and irons, and ironing in steamy, hot conditions. The pay was poor, perhaps a shilling for an entire day's work, and the work was irregular, depending on whether customers needed laundry done. Needlework and sewing were common forms of female employment, with women working either in workshops or as outworkers, taking piecework home. The pay for needlework was notoriously low, with women working 12 or 14 hours per day to earn perhaps 3 to 5 shillings per week. The work required good eyesight and manual dexterity, and it ruined the health of many workers who developed vision problems and back pain from hours bent over their work. Prostitution was a survival strategy for many poor women in Victorian London, with estimates suggesting tens of thousands of women engaged in sex work at any given time. While moralists condemned prostitutes, and while the work carried enormous stigma and legal risk, the economic reality was that prostitution could provide higher income than most legal work available to unskilled women. A prostitute might earn several shillings for a single encounter, more than a laundress or needleworker could earn in a full day of labor. For both men and women, street trading was an option that required minimal capital and no particular skills. A person could purchase goods including fruits, vegetables, fish, flowers, or various other items from wholesale markets and could sell them on the streets for small profits. The initial investment might be only a few shillings to buy starting stock, and the work offered independence and the potential to earn a decent living if one was energetic and fortunate. However, street trading was highly competitive, with thousands of costermongers competing for customers. The profit margins were small, perhaps earning sixpence profit on retail goods that cost 5 shillings to purchase. Bad weather, spoilage of goods, theft, and fines from police for obstructing streets all cut into already thin margins. Many street traders lived hand to mouth, earning just enough to buy the next day's stock with little left over for other expenses. Skilled trades, including carpentry, bricklaying, shoemaking, tailoring, and various other crafts, offered better pay and more security than unskilled labor. A skilled craftsman might earn 25 to 40 shillings per week, or even more for highly skilled work. However, becoming a skilled tradesman required serving an apprenticeship, which typically lasted 7 years, and during which the apprentice would earn little or nothing. Few poor families could afford to forgo their children's earning potential for 7 years, making pitting skilled trades largely inaccessible to the poorest classes. Clerical work, including positions as clerks in offices, shops, and pan businesses, offered relatively good pay and respectable status for those with sufficient education. A clerk might earn £100 to £200 per year, which would support a middle-class lifestyle. However, these positions required literacy, numeracy, and often required knowing someone who could provide a reference or point who had influence with employers. Poor point children who left school at young point ages to work had little chance of obtaining clerical positions. The strategy for surviving through employment in Victorian London involved being willing to take whatever work was available, working extremely long hours when work could be found, developing multiple income streams by combining different types of work, and constantly being alert for better opportunities. A person might work as a dock laborer some days, as a porter other days, and might sell point items on the street in spare time, piecing together enough income to survive. The understanding that unemployment or underemployment could strike at any time meant that prudent workers would save whatever they could during good periods to sustain themselves through inevitable bad periods. However, the low wages meant that most workers lived paycheck to paycheck with no savings, making them vulnerable to any disruption in income. Chapter 3. Obtaining food and avoiding starvation with accommodation secured and some form of income established. The next survival challenge in Victorian London was obtaining adequate food. The cost of food consumed a large portion of working-class budgets, and the quality and nutritional value of affordable food were often inadequate. Let us examine the Victorian London food supply and eating strategies in detail. The diet of poor Londoners was monotonous, nutritionally deficient, and often barely sufficient to prevent starvation. The staple food was bread, which would be purchased daily from bakeries that existed in every neighbourhood. A £4 loaf of bread might cost 6p to 9p, depending on the quality and the current price of wheat. This bread would form the basis of most meals, eaten plain or with whatever small additions could be afforded. Tea was the universal beverage among the poor, consumed many times per day. The tea would be strong and would be sweetened with sugar if any could be afforded. Milk might be added if available, though milk was relatively expensive and was often adulterated by dishonest dealers who would water it down or add chalk or other substances to increase volume and profit. A pound of tea might cost 3 to 4 shillings, and a pound of sugar would cost 4 pence to 6 pence, representing significant expenses for poor families. Butter or margarine would be spread on bread when finances permitted. Butter was expensive at over a shilling per pound, while margarine, which was developed in the 1860s as a cheap alternative to butter, cost considerably less but was viewed with suspicion by many consumers. Dripping, which was rendered animal fat collected from cooking meat, was another cheap alternative used to make bread more palatable. Potatoes were an important dietary staple, as they were filling and relatively cheap. A pound of potatoes might cost a penny or 2 pence, making them affordable even for very poor families. Potatoes would be boiled and eaten with bread, or might be mashed if a bit of milk and butter could be obtained. In periods of extreme poverty, potatoes might be the only food aside from bread that a family could afford. Meat was a luxury that the poorest families could rarely afford. When meat could be purchased, it would be the cheapest cuts, including scraps, offal, or bones, with some meat attached that could be made into stews or soups. A pound of cheap meat might cost 6 pence to a shilling, representing perhaps a quarter of a laborer's daily wages. Meat would be stretched by making it into stews with potatoes, onions, and whatever vegetables could be obtained, creating dishes that would feed a family for multiple meals. The meat sold to the poor was often of questionable quality, being meat from old or diseased animals, or meat that had begun to spoil and was sold at reduced prices. The strong seasoning and cooking in stews would disguise the poor quality to some extent. Working-class shoppers learned to examine meat carefully and to know which butchers could be trusted to sell relatively fresh products. Fish was sometimes more affordable than meat, particularly in the form of salted or smoked fish, including herrings, which could be purchased cheaply. Fresh fish was available from street sellers who would purchase fish at early morning markets and would sell it throughout the day, often at reduced prices as the day wore on and the fish became less fresh. A meal of fish and potatoes could provide protein and calories at modest cost. Cheese was another protein source that could be purchased in small quantities. A few ounces of cheap cheese might cost 3 pence or 4 pence and could be made to last for several meals by eating only small portions with bread. The cheese sold to the poor would be basic and strong-flavored, but it added variety and nutrition to otherwise monotonous diets. Vegetables beyond potatoes were often too expensive for poor families to purchase regularly. Onions were relatively cheap and were used to flavor stews and soups. Cabbages might be purchased when in season and cheap. Other vegetables, including carrots, turnips, or peas, would be luxuries rather than regular parts of the diet. The lack of fresh vegetables meant that working-class diets were deficient in vitamins and other nutrients, contributing to health problems. The purchasing of food required careful budgeting and constant attention to prices. A working-class housewife would know the prices charged by different shops and street vendors and would walk considerable distances to save a half penny or penny on a purchase. Many families purchased food on credit during the week when money was short, then paid their bills on Saturday after receiving wages. This credit system charged no interest but allowed shopkeepers to build customer loyalty and to profit from families who had no other options. The preparation of food in working-class homes was limited by the lack of cooking facilities. Many families had no stoves or ovens in their rooms and could not cook elaborate meals even if they could afford ingredients. A small fireplace or a portable stove might allow boiling water for tea and for boiling potatoes, but roasting or baking was impossible. This meant that much of working-class food was either purchased already cooked from street vendors and cookshops, or consisted of foods that required minimal cooking. Street food vendors were ubiquitous in Victorian London, selling everything from fried fish to pies to baked potatoes to pea soup to coffee to various other prepared foods. A hungry person could purchase a filling meal from a street vendor for 3 pence to 6 pence, which was convenient for workers who lacked cooking facilities or time. The quality and hygiene of street food varied enormously, with some vendors offering decent food while others sold food that was unsafe or was made from questionable ingredients. Cookshops and penny restaurants provided cheap hot meals for working people. A portion of meat pie or a plate of stew with bread or another simple dish could be purchased for a penny to 3 pence and could be eaten on the premises or could be taken away. These establishments filled an important role for people who needed hot food but who lacked the means to cook it themselves. Pubs and public houses served food as well as alcohol, and many working men would eat their main meals in pubs, combining eating with drinking and socializing. A ploughman's lunch of bread, cheese, and pickled onions might cost 4p, while a more substantial meal might cost 6p to a shilling. The pub meals were filling and were served in convivial atmospheres, but the temptation to spend money on drink as well as food meant that many men spent more than they could afford. The strategy for avoiding starvation in Victorian London involved ruthless budgeting, purchasing the cheapest foods available, preparing simple but filling meals, supplementing purchased food with whatever could be obtained for free, including scraps from charitable institutions, and going hungry when necessary to make limited resources stretch further. Many families, particularly children, were chronically malnourished despite working constantly to earn enough food. The understanding that food insecurity was a constant threat shaped working-class life and drove much behavior, including the willingness to accept dangerous or degrading work, the involvement in petty crime to supplement income, and the constant stress and anxiety about whether there would be enough to eat tomorrow. Survival in Victorian London meant accepting hunger as a regular part of life and developing resilience to the physical and psychological impacts of inadequate nutrition. Chapter 4. Avoiding disease and injury. Victorian London was an extremely unhealthy place where disease and injury were constant threats to survival. Understanding the health hazards and knowing how to minimize risks were essential survival skills. Let us examine the disease environment and health survival strategies in methodical detail. The mortality rate in Victorian London was high compared to rural areas, with life expectancy for poor Londoners being perhaps 40 years or less. The causes of this high mortality were numerous and included infectious diseases, industrial accidents, violent crime, and the general unhealthiness of urban life. Children were particularly vulnerable, with perhaps 1 in 3 children dying before the age of 5 from diseases, including diarrhea, respiratory infections, measles, scarlet fever, and various other causes. The port supply in Victorian London for most of the century was contaminated and was a major source of disease. Water was drawn from the Pos and from the Thames River, which also received the city's sewage, or from wells that were contaminated by seepage from cesspits. The drinking of this contaminated water spread diseases including cholera, typhoid fever, and various gastrointestinal infections that killed thousands annually. The Great Cholera epidemics of 1832, 1849, 1854, and 1866 killed tens of thousands of Londoners and terrified the population. Cholera caused severe diarrhea and dehydration that could kill within hours or days. The disease spread through contaminated water, though this was not understood until Dr. John Snow's famous investigation of the 1854 outbreak. The survival strategy regarding cholera was to avoid drinking water from pumps known to be contaminated, to boil water when possible, and to rely on beer or tea, which were safer due to the boiling involved in their preparation. Typhoid fever was another waterborne disease that was endemic in Victorian London. The disease caused high fever, digestive problems, and often death. Those who survived might have lingering health problems for months. The only prevention was avoiding contaminated water and maintaining hygiene, though the connection between sanitation and disease was not widely understood for much of the Victorian period. Tuberculosis, also called consumption, was the single largest killer in Victorian London, causing perhaps 1/3 of all deaths. The disease attacked the lungs and caused progressive wasting, chronic coughing, fever, and eventually death. Tuberculosis spread through close contact and through breathing air in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, making the overcrowded living conditions of the poor ideal for transmission. There was no cure for tuberculosis during the Victorian period, and diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. Though the disease might take years to kill, the survival strategy was to avoid close contact with people showing symptoms of consumption, to seek fresh air and better ventilation when possible, and to maintain general health through adequate nutrition, though this was often impossible for poor people. Many families would have members suffering from tuberculosis at any given time, and watching loved ones waste away was a common tragedy. Respiratory diseases, including bronchitis and pneumonia, were major causes of death, particularly in winter and particularly among children and elderly people. The cold, damp London climate, combined with poorly heated housing, inadequate clothing, and the polluted air filled with smoke from thousands of coal fires created ideal conditions for respiratory illnesses. The survival strategy involved keeping as warm and dry as possible, avoiding getting soaked in rain, and trying to maintain nutrition to support the immune system. Childhood diseases, including measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and diphtheria, killed large numbers of children. There were no vaccines for these diseases during most of the Victorian period, and treatment was limited to bed, rest, and hoping the child's natural immunity would prevail. Parents would watch helplessly as children suffered through high fevers, rashes, and respiratory distress, knowing that many would not survive. The peace strategy was to keep sick children isolated from healthy siblings when possible, and to provide whatever comfort and care could be managed. Smallpox had been a major killer, but became less threatening after vaccination became widespread in the mid-Victorian period. However, vaccination was not universal, and outbreaks still occurred among unvaccinated populations. The survival strategy was to get vaccinated if possible, as the smallpox vaccine was proven effective and was often available for point free from parish authorities. Industrial accidents were common threats to survival for workers in factories, on docks, in construction, and in various other occupations. Machinery in factories had no safety guards, and workers could easily get hands, arms, or clothing caught in moving parts, resulting in crushing injuries, amputations, or death. Falls from heights, being struck by falling objects, being run over by carts or trains, and various other accidents killed or injured thousands of workers annually. There was no workers' compensation or disability insurance, meaning that an injury that prevented working would result in immediate loss of income and could lead to destitution. A worker who lost a hand or arm might never work again and would face begging or the workhouse as the only options. The survival strategy was to work as carefully as possible despite pressure from employers to work quickly, to develop awareness of hazards, and to have family members who could work if the primary breadwinner was incapacitated. The medical care available to poor Londoners was limited and often ineffective. Hospitals existed, but were institutions of last resort where poor people went to die rather than to be cured. The medical knowledge of the time was limited, with doctors not understanding the germ theory of disease for most of the Victorian period, not having effective treatments for most conditions, and not having anesthesia or antiseptic surgery techniques until late in the period. For minor ailments, poor people would rely on home remedies, on patent medicines sold by street vendors and shops, or on traditional treatments passed down through families. Many of these remedies were useless or actively harmful, but they were affordable and were all that was available. For serious illnesses or injuries, people might consult a doctor if they could afford the fee, which might be several shillings for a consultation, an impossible expense for most poor families. Workhouse infirmaries provided free medical care to paupers, but the quality was poor, and the stigma of entering the workhouse meant that many people avoided this option until they had no alternative. The workhouse infirmaries were overcrowded, were staffed by untrained nurses, and had minimal supplies and equipment. Survival rates were low, and conditions were grim. The survival strategies for health in Victorian London involved maintaining cleanliness as much as possible, despite the difficulty of obtaining clean water, avoiding contact with obviously sick people, seeking fresh air when possible by walking in parks or in less built-up areas, maintaining adequate nutrition within the constraints of poverty, getting enough sleep despite poor sleeping conditions, and simply being lucky enough to avoid the diseases and accidents that struck randomly and devastatingly. The understanding that illness or injury could strike at any time and could quickly lead to destitution or death shaped Victorian working-class attitudes and behavior. People lived with constant fear and with the knowledge that their survival was precarious and depended on factors largely beyond their control. Chapter 5: Navigating Crime and Violence. Victorian London had high rates of crime and violence, and avoiding becoming a victim was an important survival skill. The poor neighborhoods where most Londoners lived were particularly dangerous, with theft, assault, and even murder being regular occurrences. Let us examine the crime environment and safety strategies. Theft in its various forms was extremely common in Victorian London. Pickpockets operated in crowded areas, including markets, streets, railway stations, and public events, quickly removing wallets, watches, handkerchiefs, and other items from victims' pockets or bags. The thieves were often children or young people who had been trained in these skills and who worked for adult criminals who would fence the stolen goods. The survival strategy for avoiding pickpockets involved keeping valuables secure in inside pockets or in purses held tightly, being constantly aware of surroundings in crowded areas, and avoiding situations where crowds pressed together tightly, creating ideal conditions for thieves. However, even vigilant people could fall victim to skilled pickpockets, and losing one's money to a thief could be catastrophic for someone living on the edge of subsistence. Burglary and housebreaking were also common, with thieves breaking into homes and lodgings to steal whatever items of value they could find. The poor housing conditions, with flimsy locks or no locks at all, made break-ins easy. The poor housing conditions, with flimsy locks or no locks at all, made break-ins easy. The poor survival strategy involved not owning anything obviously valuable that would attract thieves, hiding any money or valuables carefully, and being cautious about who knew about one's possessions. Many people slept with their valuables under their pillows or on their persons for security. Street robbery and mugging occurred frequently, particularly in poorly lit streets and alleys after dark. A person walking alone at night might be attacked by one or more robbers who would demand money and would use violence if resisted. The survival strategy was to avoid walking alone in dangerous areas after dark, to walk in groups when possible, to carry minimal money when out at night, and to comply with robbers' demands, rather than risking injury or death by resisting. Assault and violence occurred over disputes over perceived insults in the course of robberies, as a result of drunkenness, and for various other reasons. The crowded conditions, the alcohol consumption, the economic stress, and the culture of masculinity that emphasized toughness created environments where violence erupted frequently. The survival strategy involved avoiding confrontations, showing appropriate deference to people who seemed dangerous, staying away from pubs and areas where drunken violence was common, and being prepared to flee if a situation turned violent. Domestic violence was endemic in Victorian London, with many women and children suffering regular beatings from husbands and fathers. The law provided minimal protection for victims of domestic violence, and social attitudes generally accepted male authority over families. Women had little recourse against violent husbands, as divorce was nearly impossible, as police rarely intervened in domestic disputes, and as women who left abusive marriages would lose their children and would face extreme economic hardship. Sexual assault and rape were serious threats to women in Victorian London. Women walking alone, particularly after dark, were vulnerable to attack. Women in domestic service were vulnerable to assault by employers and by male members of households. The legal system provided minimal justice for rape victims, as prosecution was difficult and as victims were often blamed and shamed. The survival strategy for women involved traveling with companions when possible, avoiding isolated areas, and being constantly vigilant. Child abuse, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, and extreme neglect, was common and was largely ignored by authorities. Children working on the streets or in factories were vulnerable to exploitation and violence from employers, from customers, and from other adults. The survival strategy for children involved learning street smarts quickly, staying in groups when possible, and developing relationships with adults who could provide some protection. Organized criminal gangs operated in many poor neighborhoods, controlling territories, running protection rackets, operating illegal gambling and prostitution, and engaging in various other criminal activities. These gangs could be dangerous to ordinary residents who refused to cooperate or who somehow offended gang members. The survival strategy was to avoid conflict with gangs, to pay protection money if demanded, and to not inform to police about gang activities, as retaliation against informers was swift and brutal. The police force in Victorian London, the Metropolitan Police established in 1829, was supposed to prevent and solve crimes, but their effectiveness was limited. The force was understaffed relative to the size and population of London, was concentrated in wealthier areas rather than in poor neighborhoods where crime was highest, and was often corrupt or indifferent to crimes against poor people. A theft or assault reported to police might receive cursory investigation or might be ignored entirely. The survival strategy regarding police involved reporting serious crimes in hope of action but not expecting much, avoiding interaction with police when possible, as the police might arrest victims as well as perpetrators depending on the situation, and understanding that self-protection and community defense were more reliable than police protection. The court system and the criminal justice system were harsh and often unjust. People accused of crimes, even minor thefts, might be sentenced to transportation to police Australia, to long prison terms, or even to death for offences that would be considered minor by later standards. The survival strategy was to avoid any involvement with the criminal justice system, if possible, as even fingifi, the innocent might be convicted and harshly punished. The prisons in Victorian London, including Newgate, Pentonville and others, were horrible places where inmates were subjected to harsh discipline, poor food, hard labor and brutal conditions. Survival in prison required toughness, caution and luck. Many prisoners died from disease, from violence from other inmates, or from the harsh conditions. Upon release, ex-prisoners faced stigma and discrimination that made it difficult to find legitimate work, often driving them back into crime. Understanding the dangerous environment and developing strategies for avoiding victimization would be key essential survival skills in Victorian London. The constant threat of crime and violence created stress and required constant vigilance, but those who learned to navigate the dangers could reduce their risks and survive. Chapter 6. Dealing big key with pollution and environmental hazards. Victorian London was one of the most polluted cities in human history, and big sin, the environmental hazards posed serious threats to survival. Understanding these hazards and minimizing exposure were important survival strategies. Let us examine the pollution and environmental conditions in detail. The air quality in Victorian London was atrocious, particularly in winter when thousands of coal fires burned for heating and for industrial purposes. The smoke from these fires combined with fog from the Thames to create the infamous London pea soupers, thick smogs that reduced visibility to a few feet and that choked the lungs. The smoke contained sulfur dioxide, particulates and various other pollutants that damaged respiratory systems and contributed to chronic bronchitis, asthma, and other lung diseases. The survival strategy regarding air pollution involved staying indoors during the worst smogs when possible, covering one's face with a handkerchief or scarf when going out in heavy smoke, and accepting that respiratory problems were inevitable consequences of living in London. Some people who could afford it would leave London for the countryside during the worst winter months, but this was not an option for working people who needed to stay in the city to work. The water quality has already been mentioned regarding disease transmission, but the pollution of water also created other hazards. The Thames River was grossly polluted with sewage, industrial waste, and various garbage. The smell from the river during hot weather was overpowering, with the Great Stink of 1858 being so bad that Parliament could not function and had to consider moving out of London. The sewage and pollution in the river made it dangerous to fall in, as the filth could cause infections and as the strong currents could drown swimmers. The survival strategy regarding water pollution was to avoid contact with the Thames and with other waterways, to not eat fish caught in polluted waters, and to be careful around docks and riverside areas where one might fall into the fouled water. Children who played near the river needed to be warned about the dangers, though many poor children did swim in the Thames despite the pollution, having no other recreational options. The streets of Victorian London were filthy with horse manure, garbage, and various other refuse. The hundreds of thousands of horses used for transportation in London produced enormous quantities of manure that accumulated in streets and that attracted flies and rats. The manure would be collected by street sweepers and would be sold to farmers for fertilizer, but the collection was never adequate to keep streets clean. The garbage and refuse, including household waste, dead animals, and industrial waste, was supposed to be collected by parish authorities, but collection was irregular and inadequate. Garbage would accumulate in heaps in streets and alleys, rotting and creating horrible smells and attracting vermin. The survival strategy was to avoid walking through the filthiest areas when possible, and to not let children play in streets where garbage was worst. The noise pollution in Victorian London was intense, with constant din from street vendors calling their wares, from iron-wheeled carts and wagons clattering on cobblestone streets, from factory machinery, from construction work, from animals, and from the general hubbub of millions of people living in close proximity. The noise made sleep difficult and contributed to stress and fatigue. There was no escape from noise for poor people living in crowded neighborhoods, and the survival strategy was to develop tolerance and to learn to sleep despite the racket, the industrial pollution from factories including chemical plants, tanneries, metalworks, and various other operations created toxic emissions and discharges that contaminated air, water, and soil. Workers in these industries were exposed to dangerous chemicals and suffered high rates of poisoning, respiratory diseases, and cancer. Though the connections were not fully understood at the time, the survival strategy for those living near factories was to avoid the worst areas, if possible, and to accept the pollution as an unavoidable part of life. The lack of sanitation in poor neighborhoods meant that human waste accumulated in cesspits that would overflow, creating horrible conditions. The night soil, men who emptied cesspits, did so irregularly, and the waste would leak into streets and would contaminate wells. The stench and the health hazards from the sewage were severe, but poor people had no choice but to live with the conditions. The survival strategy involved locating latrines and privies carefully, if one had any choice in housing, avoiding the worst overflow areas, and teaching children to avoid playing in sewage-contaminated areas. The gradual construction of sewers under the direction of Joseph Bazalgette in the latter half of the Victorian period improved conditions significantly, but many areas remained unsewered throughout the period. Understanding and coping with the polluted and hazardous environment of Victorian London required awareness of dangers, avoidance of the worst exposures when possible, and resilience to the health impacts that could not be avoided. The environmental hazards were simply facts of life that all Londoners, particularly the poor who could not escape to cleaner areas, had to endure as part of surviving in the city. Chapter 7. Managing money and avoiding destitution. Economic survival in Victorian London required careful money management and strategies for avoiding the destitution that could lead to the workhouse or to homelessness. Let us examine budgeting and financial survival strategies in detail. The wages for working-class occupations, as we have discussed, were low and often irregular. A labourer might earn 15 to 20 shillings per week when work was available, but might have weeks with no work and no income. A family depending on a single wage earner would need to budget extremely carefully to survive on such limited and uncertain income. The typical working-class family budget would allocate the largest portion to rent, perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of income. For a family earning 20 shillings per week, rent of 5 to 7 shillings would consume much of the budget. Food would take another half or more of the remaining income, perhaps 8 to 10 shillings per week for a family. This would leave only a few shillings for all other expenses, including clothing, fuel for heating and cooking, lighting, healthcare, and any other needs. The survival strategy involved ruthless prioritization of expenses, with rent and food being absolute necessities that had to be paid, while everything else was flexible and could be deferred or eliminated if money was short. Families would wear ragged clothes, would go without adequate heating, would stint on food quality or quantity, and would make countless small sacrifices to make the budget stretch. The purchase of clothing was a major expense that working-class families could rarely afford. New clothing was prohibitively expensive, with a simple dress costing several shillings and a suit of clothes for a man costing several pounds. The survival strategy involved buying used clothing from second-hand dealers and from rag markets where worn garments could be purchased cheaply. Clothing would be worn until it was completely worn out, would be patched and mended repeatedly, and might be passed down from older to younger children as they grew. The pawn shop was an essential financial institution for poor Londoners, providing short-term loans secured by pawning possessions. A person who needed money before payday might pawn a coat, a watch, tools, or other items for a fraction of their value, receiving a loan that would need to be repaid with interest to reclaim the item. Many working-class families had a cycle of pawning items on Monday when money from the previous week's wages had run out, then redeeming them on Saturday after receiving the new week's wages. The pawnbroker would lend perhaps half or less of an item's value and would charge high interest rates, making pawning an expensive way to borrow money. However, it was often the only credit available to poor people, and it allowed them to survive periods when they had no other resources. Items that were not redeemed would be sold by the pawnbroker, and many families permanently lost precious possessions this way. The burial clubs and friendly societies were working-class financial institutions that provided insurance against the costs of death and of illness. Members would pay small regular contributions, perhaps a penny or 2 pence per week, and in return would receive benefits to cover funeral costs when they died or to provide sick pay when they were unable to work due to illness. These societies were important survival tools, as the cost of a funeral could be several pounds, an impossible sum for poor families to raise, and as illness that prevented working could quickly lead to destitution. The public house or pub served as a financial and social center for working-class men, where wages might be paid, where small loans might be negotiated, where business might be conducted, and where information about work opportunities might be exchanged. However, the pub was also a dangerous place financially, as the temptation to spend wages on drink was strong, and many men would drink away money needed for rent and food, causing family hardship. The survival strategy for women in families was to manage the household budget as carefully as possible, to make every penny stretch, to negotiate with shopkeepers for credit and for best prices, and to find ways to earn small amounts of money through taking in washing, sewing, or other work that could be done at home. Women's skill in household management often made the difference between survival and destitution. The threat of the workhouse hung over all poor Londoners, as anyone who could not support themselves would be sent to the workhouse, which was a form of institutionalized poverty. Conditions in workhouses were deliberately made harsh to discourage people from seeking relief, with families being separated, with inmates being required to wear uniforms, with food being minimal and unappetizing, and with hard labor being required. The workhouse was seen as a last resort to be avoided at almost any cost. The survival strategies to avoid the workhouse included working at any job available, no matter how poorly paid or unpleasant, relying on family and friends for support during hard times, turning to charity when absolutely necessary, and doing whatever was required to maintain independence. The shame and horror associated with the workhouse motivated people to endure extreme hardship rather than accepting workhouse relief. Charity organizations, including churches, philanthropic societies, and various other groups, provided some assistance to the poor, distributing food, clothing, coal for heating, and small amounts of money to those judged worthy and deserving. The key survival strategy involved knowing which charities operated in one's area, meeting their tier for worthiness, by demonstrating respectability, and by avoiding behaviors like drinking that would disqualify one from aid, and requesting help when in desperate need. However, charity was never adequate to meet the needs of London's poor, and the charities often had moralistic attitudes that blamed the poor for their poverty and that imposed conditions and judgments that were humiliating. Many poor people avoided charity except in the most desperate circumstances, preferring to maintain their dignity and independence. Understanding money management and developing strategies for financial survival were essential skills that could mean the difference between getting by and falling into complete destitution. The margin between survival and disaster was razor thin for most working-class Londoners, and financial skill and discipline were necessary for survival. Chapter 8: Final Survival Strategies and Reflections. As we conclude this exhaustive examination of how to survive Victorian London, let us reflect on the overarching survival strategies and on what the experience of survival in this harsh environment reveals about Victorian society and about human resilience. The fundamental survival strategy in Victorian London was developing resilience and accepting hardship as inevitable. The conditions we have described, including overcrowded housing, inadequate food, constant disease threats, crime and violence, pollution, and economic insecurity, were simply facts of life that could not be escaped. People who survived were those who could endure difficult conditions, who could maintain hope despite grim circumstances, and who could find meaning and purpose in life despite the hardships. The importance of family and community support cannot be overstated as a survival strategy. Families would help each other through difficult times, with relatives providing temporary housing, sharing food, lending money, and caring for children when parents were ill or working. Communities in poor neighborhoods would develop informal support networks where neighbors would help each other and would provide assistance in emergencies. However, families and communities were themselves struggling, and their ability to provide support was limited. The survival strategy involved maintaining relationships carefully, reciprocating help when possible, and understanding that support networks could collapse under too much strain. The individualism and self-reliance that were celebrated in Victorian ideology often clashed with the reality that survival required mutual support and cooperation. The development of street smarts and practical knowledge about navigating London was essential for survival. Knowing which neighborhoods were safest, which employers paid reliably, which charities would provide assistance, which pawnbrokers were least exploitative, where cheap food could be obtained, and countless other details made the difference between thriving and merely surviving or failing to survive at all. The adaptation to the seasonal rhythms of Victorian London was another survival strategy. Summer brought different challenges and opportunities than winter, with cold weather making heating costs necessary, but with summer providing longer daylight hours for work and fewer respiratory illnesses. Understanding these patterns and planning accordingly, saving in good times for bad times when possible, and adjusting strategies to seasonal conditions helped survival. The gradual improvements in conditions over the course of the Victorian period, including better sewers, cleaner water supplies, improved medical knowledge, better housing, rising wages for some workers, and various reforms and improvements made survival somewhat easier in 1900 than it had been in 1840. However, the improvements were slow and uneven, and many people continued to live in terrible conditions throughout the period. The question of whether Victorian London was a survivable environment must be answered with qualification. Millions of people did survive and did build lives in Victorian London, and the city grew and thrived despite its problems. However, the human cost was enormous, with high mortality rates, chronic ill health, stunted life expectancies, and widespread suffering. Survival was possible, but required constant effort, considerable luck, and acceptance of conditions that would be considered intolerable today. The lessons of Victorian London survival remain relevant to understanding poverty and urban life in developing nations today, where many of the same challenges, including overcrowding, inadequate housing, contaminated water, poor sanitation, limited healthcare, and economic insecurity, persist. The strategies that Victorian Londoners used to survive, including family support, community networks, multiple income streams, careful budgeting, and resilience, continue to be employed by poor people worldwide. The historical examination of survival in Victorian London also reveals the importance of public health, infrastructure, of labor rights and protections, of social safety nets, and of progressive reforms in creating livable cities. The improvements in London over the 20th century that transformed it from a Victorian death trap into a modern city with relatively good living conditions demonstrate that urban problems are not inevitable, but can be addressed through collective action and social investment. Chapter 9. Child Survival Strategies. Children faced particular survival challenges in Victorian London, and understanding how they navigated these hazards reveals important dimensions of the survival experience. Let us examine in detail what strategies children and their families employed to ensure children's survival in this hostile environment. Infant mortality in Victorian London was appallingly high, with perhaps 150 to 200 infants dying per 1,000 births in poor neighborhoods. The first year of life was the most dangerous, with babies dying from diarrheal diseases, respiratory infections, malnutrition, and various other causes. The survival of an infant depended heavily on the mother's health, on the ability to breastfeed successfully, and on avoiding the contaminated water and foods that could cause deadly infections. The strategy for infant survival involved breastfeeding exclusively for as long as possible, as breast milk was safer than any alternative. Women who could not breastfeed would need to find wet nurses or would need to bottle feed with cow's milk or with various gruels and paps, but these alternatives were dangerous. The bottles and their nipples were difficult to clean properly, and the milk would quickly spoil, causing stomach infections that killed countless babies. The understanding that breastfeeding was safest was widespread, but many women could not breastfeed due to poor nutrition, illness, or the need to return to work soon after giving birth. Childhood diseases, as mentioned earlier, killed large numbers of children who survived infancy. Measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, and various other infections swept through poor neighborhoods regularly, and families with multiple children would often lose one or more to disease. The survival strategy involved isolating sick children from healthy ones when space permitted, providing whatever nursing care could be managed, and hoping that the child's constitution would be strong enough to overcome the illness. Parents understood that child death was common and to some extent inevitable, and this understanding shaped their emotional responses and their family planning. Families would have many children, partly because they expected that some would die, and this calculation, while grim, was a rational response to the mortality environment. The grief over losing children was real and profound, but it had to be managed alongside the need to care for surviving children and to continue working and living. The education of children in Victorian London was limited for most of the working class until late in the period, when elementary education became compulsory. Before compulsory education, most poor children received minimal or no formal schooling and instead began working at very young ages to contribute to family income. The survival strategy regarding education involved balancing the potential long-term benefits of literacy against the immediate need for children's earnings. For families in extreme poverty, there was no choice and children would begin working as soon as they were old enough to be useful. Perhaps at age 5 or 6, children would work as chimney sweeps, as street vendors, as errand runners, in factories alongside adults, in domestic service, and in countless other occupations. The work was often dangerous, the hours were long, the pay was minimal, and the impact on children's health and development was severe. The survival strategy for working children involved learning their trades quickly to avoid punishment from employers, staying alert to dangers to avoid accidents, and handing over their earnings to parents to contribute to family survival. Children who kept their wages or who failed to earn adequately might be beaten or might be thrown out of their families, so there was enormous pressure to perform and to contribute. The street children who had no families or who had been abandoned or who had run away from abusive homes faced particularly difficult survival challenges. These children would survive through begging, through petty theft, through selling small items like matches or flowers on the streets, through scavenging for salvageable items in garbage, and through whatever other means they could devise. The life expectancy for street children was very low, and many died young from disease, from accidents, from violence, or from exposure to weather. The survival strategies for street children included forming gangs or groups that provided mutual protection and support, developing relationships with adult criminals who might provide some assistance in exchange for participation in crimes, finding shelters in abandoned buildings or under bridges where they could sleep relatively safely, and staying constantly mobile and alert to avoid being caught by police or by hostile adults. Charitable institutions including ragged schools, orphanages, and children's homes provided some assistance to poor and orphaned children, offering basic education, housing, and care. However, these institutions were never adequate to meet the need, were often harsh and punitive in their methods, and sometimes exploited the children in their care. The survival strategy for children might involve accepting placement in these institutions as preferable to life on the streets, even though the institutions were far from ideal. The adolescent years brought new survival challenges as children grew into young adults. Young women faced risks of sexual exploitation and unwanted pregnancy, which could ruin their lives and their employment prospects. Young men faced pressure to prove their masculinity through fighting, drinking, and other risky behaviors, and they faced the challenge of establishing themselves in occupations that could support eventual families. The survival strategy for adolescents involved making the transition to adult work, learning trades, or developing skills that could provide reliable income, avoiding the worst risks of pregnancy and disease, staying out of serious trouble with the law, and beginning to think about marriage and family formation. The successful navigation of adolescence was a critical survival challenge that determined adult life trajectories. The protection of children from the worst abuses and exploitation gradually improved over the Victorian period through various reforms, including restrictions on child labor, compulsory education, and the creation of agencies like the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. However, these reforms came slowly and applied unevenly, and many children continued to suffer throughout the period. Understanding child survival in Victorian London reveals both the resilience of children who endured terrible conditions and the callousness of a society that allowed children to suffer so grievously. The survival of children depended on their families, on their own resourcefulness, on luck, and on the gradual improvements in social conditions that reduced but never eliminated the hazards they faced. Chapter 10. The Workhouse System and Institutional Survival. For those who failed to survive through their own efforts in Victorian London, the workhouse was the institution of last resort. Understanding the workhouse system and the strategies for surviving within it or for avoiding it reveals another crucial dimension of Victorian survival. Let us examine the workhouse in exhaustive detail. The workhouse system was established by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 to provide relief to the destitute while deterring people from seeking public assistance. The philosophy behind the workhouse was that conditions inside should be worse than the worst conditions outside, so that only the truly desperate would accept workhouse relief. This principle of less eligibility meant that workhouses were deliberately made harsh and unpleasant. The process of entering the workhouse began with applying for relief to the Board of Guardians who administered the local Poor Law Union. The applicant would need to prove that they were truly destitute and unable to support themselves, which involved demonstrating that they had no resources, no family who could help, and no ability to work. The investigation could be intrusive and humiliating, with officials examining the applicant's circumstances and making moral judgments about whether they deserved assistance. If relief was granted, the applicant would enter the workhouse and would be required to remain there rather than receiving outdoor relief that would allow them to live in the community. Upon entry, families would be separated, with men, women, and children being sent to different sections of the workhouse. Married couples would be separated and would not be allowed to see each other, except perhaps briefly on Sundays. Parents would be separated from their children, causing enormous anguish. The first step upon entering the workhouse was being bathed and having one's own clothing taken away and replaced with the workhouse uniform. The uniform was made from rough fabric, was institutional and dehumanizing, and marked the wearer as a pauper. Personal possessions would be taken and stored, as inmates were not allowed to keep their belongings. The accommodation in workhouses was basic and institutional, with dormitories containing rows of beds, with minimal privacy, with strict rules about behavior, and with constant supervision by workhouse staff. The beds would be simple, and would have basic bedding, better than the worst common lodging houses, but still uncomfortable and cheerless. The dormitories would be crowded and noisy, making sleep difficult. The food in workhouses was deliberately monotonous and minimal, providing just enough nutrition to prevent starvation but not enough to provide satisfaction or pleasure. A typical workhouse diet might consist of bread and gruel for breakfast, bread and cheese for dinner, bread and broth for supper, with small variations perhaps including occasional meat or vegetables. The food was bland, was often of poor quality, and was served in measured portions that left inmates feeling hungry. The work required of able-bodied inmates was designed to be unpleasant and unproductive, as the goal was deterrence, rather than useful labor. Men might be required to break stones or to pick oakum, which was unraveling old rope fiber by hand, tedious and painful work that served no purpose beyond keeping inmates occupied. Women might be required to do laundry, to clean, to sew, or to pick oakum, which was unraveling old rope fiber by hand, tedious and painful work that served no purpose beyond keeping inmates occupied. Women might be required to do laundry, to clean, to sew, or to pick oakum. The work would continue for many hours each day with minimal breaks. The discipline in workhouses was strict, with rules governing every aspect of life, including when to wake, when to eat, when to work or sleep, and what behaviors were permitted. Talking during meals might be forbidden. Contact between men and women was prohibited. Leaving the workhouse grounds required permission, and infractions of rules would be punished with reduced food rations, with confinement in punishment cells, or with other penalties. The survival strategy for those who entered the workhouse was to endure the conditions, to follow the rules to avoid punishment, to maintain hope of eventually leaving, and to preserve one's humanity and dignity despite the dehumanizing environment. Many inmates became institutionalized and lost the ability or the will to leave, spending years or even the rest of their lives in the workhouse. The sick wards or infirmaries in workhouses provided medical care to inmates who became ill, but the quality of care was poor. The nursing staff were often untrained pauper inmates themselves. The facilities were basic, the supplies and medications were limited, and the medical knowledge was no better than in society generally. Sick inmates would suffer in crowded wards, with minimal comfort or treatment. The elderly who entered workhouses often never left, as they were unable to work and support themselves. The old age wards of workhouses were where many Victorian poor spent their final years, separated from families, living in institutional dreariness, waiting for death. The survival strategy for the elderly in workhouses was simply to endure with whatever dignity could be maintained and to find small comforts in friendships with other inmates or in religious faith. The children in workhouses were supposed to receive education and training that would prepare them for work, but the quality was poor and the focus was on instilling discipline and deference rather than on developing skills. Children would be taught basic reading and writing, would be trained in menial tasks and would be apprenticed to employers when old enough, often to positions that were little better than slavery. The strategy for avoiding the workhouse was pursued desperately by poor Londoners who understood the horrors of the institution. People would accept almost any hardship, would work at any job no matter how poorly paid, would go hungry, would live in the worst slums, would sacrifice everything to avoid entering the workhouse. The shame and the loss of freedom associated with the workhouse were seen as worse than almost any alternative. For those who had no choice and who entered the workhouse, the goal was to leave as quickly as possible. An inmate who recovered health, who found work, or who could demonstrate ability to support themselves could apply for discharge. However, the process was slow, required approval from the guardians, and might be denied arbitrarily. Many inmates who wanted to leave were kept against their will because officials decided they would simply return when their resources ran out. The workhouse system reveals the Victorian attitudes toward poverty and toward the poor, viewing destitution as a moral failing rather than as a structural problem, and designing institutions to punish the poor rather than to help them. The survival of the workhouse system throughout the Victorian period, despite its cruelty, shows the power of ideological commitments to punishment, limited government, and to individual responsibility, even when those commitments caused immense suffering. Understanding the workhouse and developing strategies to avoid it or to survive it was an essential part of the overall survival challenge in Victorian London. The workhouse stood as a threat that motivated people to punish extraordinary efforts to remain independent, and it served as a final refuge for those who had exhausted all other options. Chapter 11: Seasonal Survival, Challenges and Winter Hardships. The survival challenges in Victorian London varied significantly by season, with winter bringing particular hazards that required specific survival strategies. Let us examine the seasonal cycles and focus particularly on the difficulties of surviving winter in this harsh urban environment. Winter in Victorian London typically brought cold temperatures, though extreme cold was less common than in more northern climates. The temperatures might drop to freezing or below, but more commonly would hover in the range of 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold was made worse by the dampness that pervaded London due to its position on the Thames, and due to the frequent rain and fog. The damp cold penetrated clothing and housing and chilled people to the bone more effectively than drier cold might have done. The told survival strategy for staying warm in winter required obtaining fuel for fires, having adequate clothing, and finding or creating shelter from the elements. For poor Londoners, all of these were serious challenges. Fuel, including coal and wood, cost money that many families could not afford, particularly in winter, when heating was most needed and when prices were highest. A hundredweight of coal, which was about £112, might cost a shilling or more, a significant expense for a family earning perhaps 20 shillings per week. The strategy for obtaining fuel involved purchasing coal in small quantities as money became available, perhaps a few pounds at a time for a few pence, though this meant paying much higher prices per pound than those who could afford to buy by the hundredweight. Families would burn as little coal as possible, heating only one room if they had multiple rooms, keeping fires low and banking them at night to conserve fuel, and going without heat when they had no money for coal. Scavenging for fuel was another survival strategy, with children being sent to search for scraps of wood, fallen tree branches, or lumps of coal dropped by coal wagons that could be gathered and used for fires. The scavenging would take hours and would yield only small amounts of fuel, but desperate families would use every resource available. Some children would steal coal from coal yards or would pick through cinders from fires to find partially burned coal that could be reused. The clothing needed for winter warmth was a major challenge for poor people who owned minimal wardrobes and who could not afford winter coats, boots, or adequate layers. The survival strategy involved wearing all available clothing in layers, wrapping in blankets or shawls when indoors, and staying indoors as much as possible during the coldest weather. However, many people had to work outdoors regardless of weather, and they would suffer from cold exposure while performing their jobs. The inadequate heating and clothing meant that poor Londoners were chronically cold in winter, which contributed to illness, reduced their ability to work effectively, caused physical misery, and made simple survival a daily challenge. The cold-related illnesses, including chilblains, frostbite in extreme cases, and respiratory infections from breathing cold, damp air, were common winter afflictions. The winter also brought shorter daylight hours, which meant that more of each day was spent in darkness. Artificial lighting, including candles, oil lamps, or later gas lighting, cost money and was used as sparingly as possible. Poor families would sit in darkness for hours in the evening to save lighting costs, going to bed early partly to avoid needing light and partly to stay warmer under bed covers than sitting in cold rooms. The combination of darkness, cold, and confinement indoors for long hours made winter psychologically as well as physically difficult. The depression that many people experienced during long dark winters was not recognized as a medical condition but was simply endured as part of the winter experience. The survival strategy involved maintaining routines, finding indoor activities to occupy time, and looking forward to spring when conditions would improve. The winter also brought increased disease risks, particularly respiratory illnesses. The cold, damp air, the crowded indoor conditions, the lack of ventilation in rooms kept closed against cold, and the weakened immune systems of people suffering from malnutrition and cold stress all contributed to high winter death rates. The survival strategy involved trying to stay healthy through adequate food if it could be afforded, through avoiding exposure to obviously sick people, and through hope and luck. The threat of starvation was greater in winter than other seasons, as food prices might be higher due to reduced agricultural production and increased demand, as income might be reduced due to weather-related disruptions of work, and as the calories needed to maintain body temperature in cold weather increased nutritional requirements. Families that barely managed to survive in summer might face crisis in winter when their fragile balance tipped toward destitution. The charitable giving that increased during the Christmas season provided some relief, with churches and philanthropic organizations distributing food, coal, blankets, and other necessities to the deserving poor. The survival strategy involved applying to these charities, demonstrating worthiness through respectability and gratitude, and accepting whatever assistance was offered. However, charity was never sufficient to meet all needs, and many families received no assistance. The celebration of Christmas brought a brief respite from winter gloom for those who could afford even minimal celebration. A Christmas dinner might include meat that would not be afforded at other times, a small gift for children, and time spent with family in warmth and relative comfort. For the very poor, Christmas might bring only disappointment, as they could not provide the celebration that the season suggested. But even minimal observance provided psychological comfort. The spring arrival would bring enormous relief, with warming weather, longer daylight hours, the renewal of plant life in parks and gardens, and the sense that survival through another winter had been achieved. The survival strategies that had sustained families through winter could be relaxed somewhat, coal consumption could be reduced, outdoor work became more available, and the general improvement in conditions lifted spirits and improved health. Understanding the seasonal cycles and developing strategies to cope with winter hardships were essential survival skills in Victorian London. Those who successfully navigated repeated winters built resilience and developed knowledge about managing resources across seasons that would serve them throughout their lives. Chapter 12: Daily Routines and Time Management for Survival. The daily routine of poor Londoners was structured around the imperative of survival, with every hour being accounted for in terms of earning income, performing necessary tasks, and preserving strength for the next day's labor. Let us examine a typical daily routine to understand how survival was pursued hour by hour. The day for most working people would begin very early, perhaps at 5 or 6 in the morning, or even earlier depending on the occupation and the commute to work. There was no sleeping, no leisurely mornings, as every hour of potential work represented income that could not be sacrificed. The pillar survival strategy was to rise as early as necessary to reach work on time and to maximize earnings. The morning routine in a working-class home would be hurried and minimal. There would be no hot water for washing, so a cold water splash at a basin would suffice. Dressing would be quick, putting on the same clothes worn the previous day, as working people typically owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothing. Breakfast would be minimal, perhaps a piece of bread and a cup of tea if there was time, or nothing at all if the person was running late or had no food available. The commute to work might involve walking considerable distances, as transport was expensive and working people would save their pennies by walking. A worker might walk an hour or more each way between home and work, adding 2 or more hours to their working day. The survival strategy was to walk quickly to save time, to know the most direct routes, and to avoid areas where one might be delayed or robbed. The work day would typically last 10 to 12 hours or even longer for some occupations. Factory workers might work from 6 in the morning until 6 at night, with brief breaks for meals. Domestic servants might work from early morning until late evening, with even longer for hours. Dock workers would work as long as there were ships to load or unload. The hours were exhausting, but the survival imperative drove people to work as long as employers demanded. The lunch break during the workday would be brief, perhaps 30 minutes, and the meal would be simple. A worker might bring bread and cheese from home, might purchase something cheap from a street vendor, or might eat nothing at all if money was too tight. The survival strategy was to eat enough to maintain energy for work, but to spend as little as possible on midday meals. The evening return from work would again involve the walk home, arriving perhaps at 7 or 8 in the evening exhausted from the long day. The evening return from work would again involve the walk home, arriving perhaps at 7 or 8 in the evening exhausted from the long day. The evening return from work would again involve the walk home, arriving perhaps at 7 or 8 in the evening exhausted from the long day. The evening return would involve eating the main meal of the day, if resources allowed, with the family gathering for a simple supper of bread, potatoes, and perhaps a bit of meat or cheese. The meal would be eaten quickly, as everyone would be tired and would want to rest. The evening hours after supper would be brief before bedtime, as working people needed sleep to recover for the next day's labor. There would be little time or energy for leisure activities, for socializing beyond the immediate family, or for entertainment. Some men might go to the pub for an hour or two, but this was time and money that could not really be afforded. Women would use evening hours to mend clothing, to prepare food for the next day, or to do other household tasks. Bedtime would come early, perhaps at 9 or 10 o'clock, as rising time would be 5 or 6 in the morning. The survival strategy was to get as much sleep as possible to maintain health and work capacity. However, sleep quality was poor due to uncomfortable beds, noise from neighbors and from the street, cold or heat, depending on season, and the stress and worry that poor people carried constantly. The weekly routine would vary little from day to day, with the same pattern repeated 6 days per week. Sunday might bring some relief with no work for many occupations, allowing for extra sleep, for church attendance, for those who were religious, for family time, or for catching up on tasks that could not be done during the work week. However, Sunday was not truly a day of rest for women who had laundry, cooking, and other household tasks that consumed the day. The monthly routine was structured around pay periods, with most workers being paid weekly on Saturday. Saturday evening after receiving wages would be when rent was paid, when debts to shopkeepers would be settled, when pawnshop items would be redeemed, and when a bit of extra food might be purchased for Sunday dinner. The survival strategy was to budget carefully to make the week's wages cover all necessary expenses, with perhaps a tiny surplus that could be saved. The yearly routine brought seasonal variations, as we have discussed, with winter being the most difficult period and summer offering relative relief. The survival strategy over the course of a year involved saving in summer impossible to help survive winter, accepting that some months would be better than others, and simply persevering through the difficult times knowing the conditions would eventually improve. Understanding the daily and temporal rhythms of survival reveals that Victorian working-class life was relentless and exhausting, with no true rest, no margin for error, and no time for the pursuits that make life meaningful beyond mere survival. The day-to-day grind of working, eating minimal food, sleeping poorly, and repeating the cycle endlessly was the reality for millions of Londoners throughout the Victorian period. Chapter 13: Transportation, Navigation, and Moving Through the City. Surviving Victorian London required the ability to navigate the vast metropolis, to understand transportation options, and to move efficiently and safely through diverse neighborhoods. Let us examine these mobility challenges and survival strategies in detail. Victorian London was enormous, covering hundreds of square miles by the end of the period, and traveling from one part of the city to another could take hours for poor people who depended on walking for transport. This meant that employment opportunities were limited to areas within walking distance of their housing. The point survival strategy involved choosing housing that was as close as possible to work areas, even if the neighborhood was unpleasant, to minimize time and energy spent commuting. The street system in Victorian London was complex and confusing. particularly in older areas where streets had developed organically over centuries with no planning or rational layout. Streets might be narrow, winding, and would often change names multiple times along their lengths. The survival strategy for navigating required learning one's local area thoroughly, asking directions from locals when venturing into unfamiliar areas, and paying attention to landmarks including churches, pubs, and notable buildings that could serve as reference points. For those who could afford it, omnibuses provided public transportation with horse-drawn vehicles carrying passengers along fixed routes for a fare. The fare might be 3p to 6p depending on distance, which was expensive for working-class people but which might be affordable occasionally or, for those earning somewhat higher wages, the omnibus allowed traveling distances that would take hours to walk in, perhaps 30 minutes to an hour, expanding the range of potential employment. The survival strategy regarding omnibus use involved knowing which routes went where, knowing the fares, saving the book expense for situations where the time saved justified the cost, and being willing to walk when money was tight. The omnibuses were often crowded, and getting a seat required boarding at popular stops early or being willing to stand hanging on to the outside of the vehicle, which was uncomfortable and somewhat dangerous. The railway system that developed throughout the Victorian period provided faster transport than omnibuses for longer distances, with trains carrying passengers from suburbs into central London and between different parts of the city. The railway fares were initially too expensive for working-class daily use, but the introduction of workmen's trains with special cheap fares made train commuting feasible for some workers. The workmen's trains would run early in the morning, perhaps between 5 and 7 o'clock, and would charge very low fares, perhaps 2p for a journey that would normally cost 6p or more. The survival strategy for workers living in cheaper suburban housing was to use workmen's trains to commute to central London employment, trading longer commute time and the early rising required to catch the trains for the savings in housing costs from living in suburbs rather than in central slums. The Thames River served as a major transportation route, with watermen operating small boats that would ferry passengers across the river or along it for a penny or 2p. The survival strategy involved using river transport when it was the most direct route, when bridges were far away or crowded, or when time was critical. However, the Thames was polluted and dangerous, and falling into the water could cause serious illness or drowning, so river transport carried risks. The gradual development of the London Underground railway system in the latter part of the Victorian period provided a new form of transport, with trains running in tunnels beneath the city streets. The Underground was initially expensive and was used primarily by middle-class commuters, but it eventually became more affordable and more extensive. The survival strategy involved learning which underground lines went where and using them when the fare could be justified by time savings. For transporting goods rather than oneself, various options existed, including hiring carts or porters to carry heavy or bulky items, using the extensive system of canals that connected different parts of London for shipping goods, or simply carrying items oneself. The survival strategy for someone who needed to transport belongings when moving from one lodging to another involved borrowing or renting a handcart, making multiple trips carrying what could be managed, or hiring a porter if absolutely necessary, despite the expense. The knowledge of safe routes and dangerous areas was critical survival information. Certain neighborhoods were notorious for crime and violence, and walking through these areas, particularly after dark, was extremely dangerous. The survival strategy involved knowing which streets and neighborhoods to avoid, taking longer routes that avoided the most dangerous areas when necessary, and traveling in groups when possible for safety. The street lighting in Victorian London improved significantly over the period, progressing from occasional oil lamps to gas lighting that was much brighter and more reliable. However, even with gas lighting, many streets, particularly in poor neighborhoods, remained dark at night. The survival strategy involved carrying a lantern when traveling after dark if one could afford it, memorizing routes so that navigation was possible in darkness, and simply staying home after dark when possible. The traffic in Victorian London was heavy and chaotic, with thousands of horse-drawn vehicles, including carts, wagons, omnibuses, and private carriages crowding the streets, along with pedestrians, street vendors, and animals. Crossing busy streets was dangerous, and pedestrians could easily be struck by vehicles or trampled by horses. The survival strategy involved waiting for gaps in traffic, crossing quickly and confidently, and maintaining awareness of vehicles approaching from all directions. The understanding of London's geography and of transportation options expanded over time as people lived in the city longer and as they traveled to different areas for work or for other reasons. Newcomers to London would have limited geographic knowledge and would depend on asking directions, on following others who knew the way, and on gradual learning through trial and error. The survival strategy involved learning quickly, paying attention to routes and landmarks, and building mental maps of a city that would guide future navigation. The social networks that people built in their neighborhoods provided information about navigation and transportation that was invaluable for survival. Neighbors would share knowledge about which omnibus routes were reliable, about where cheap goods could be purchased, about which streets to avoid, and about countless other details that made life more manageable. The survival strategy involved building these networks through friendly interaction with neighbors, through reciprocating information and assistance, and through maintaining reputation as a trustworthy community member. Chapter 14: Social Networks, Community, and Mutual Aid Beyond Individual Survival Strategies. The social networks and communities that Victorian Londoners built were essential survival resources. Let us examine how these networks functioned and how people used them to improve their chances of survival. The neighborhood community was the primary social unit for most working-class Londoners, with people knowing their immediate neighbors, shopping at the same local stores, drinking at the same pubs, and attending the same churches or chapels. These neighborhood ties created informal support systems where neighbors would help each other in emergencies, would share information about work opportunities, would watch each other's children, and would provide various other forms of assistance. The survival strategy involved being a good neighbor, which meant being friendly and helpful when possible, maintaining one's home and behavior to neighborhood standards, respecting the privacy and property of others, and reciprocating assistance when one had received help. A person with a good reputation in the neighborhood could call on neighbors for support in times of crisis, while someone who was difficult or troublesome would find themselves isolated and without support. The extended family network, when it existed and when family members lived near each other, provided another layer of support. Relatives would help each other find employment, would provide temporary housing when someone was evicted, or when newcomers arrived in London, would loan money in emergencies, and would care for children or elderly family members who could not care for themselves. The survival strategy involved maintaining family relationships despite the stresses of poverty, helping family members when possible, and accepting that family obligations were reciprocal and ongoing. However, family networks could also be sources of stress and drain on resources. A family member who was constantly in trouble, who drank excessively, or who could not hold employment, might be a burden that other family members could not afford but could not abandon. The survival strategy required balancing family loyalty against practical limitations on what assistance could be provided. The workplace created social networks among co-workers who might help each other learn jobs, might cover for each other when someone was ill or late, might share information about better employment opportunities, and might provide companionship and support during long working hours. The survival strategy involved building good relationships with co-workers, demonstrating reliability and competence, and participating in the informal reciprocity that characterize workplace relationships. The friendly societies and trade unions that organized working people created formal networks that provided mutual aid and collective bargaining power. A member of a friendly society would pay regular dues and would receive benefits including sick pay when unable to work due to illness, death, benefits to cover funeral costs, and sometimes social activities and fellowship. The survival strategy involved joining a friendly society if possible, maintaining membership through regular dues payments, and using the society's resources when needed. Trade unions, which organized workers in particular industries or crafts, fought for better wages and working conditions and provided support to members during strikes or lockouts. Union membership required dues and required participation in collective action, including strikes that could be risky. The survival strategy involved weighing the costs and risks of union membership against the potential benefits of collective action, joining unions when they seemed likely to improve conditions, and participating in collective action when called upon. The religious institutions, including churches and chapels, provided both spiritual support and practical assistance to their members and to the surrounding communities. Churches ran charitable programs distributing food, clothing, coal, and other necessities to the deserving poor. They provided social activities, including Sunday schools for children, social gatherings for adults, and various programs that created community and fellowship. The survival strategy involved attending church regularly if one was religious, or even if not genuinely religious but needing access to church charity, demonstrating respectability and worthiness to receive assistance, and participating in church community life. The pub or public house served as a social center, particularly for men, where workers would gather after work to drink, to socialize, to discuss news and politics, to conduct business, and to maintain social relationships. The pub provided warmth and light in winter, provided escape from cramped and unpleasant housing, and provided human connection and fellowship. The survival strategy involved moderate use of pubs to maintain social networks without spending excessive money on drink, knowing which pubs were frequented by people in one's trade or industry who might provide work, information, and using the pub as a place to make contacts and to maintain reputation. The informal economies and mutual aid systems in poor neighborhoods created networks where people would exchange goods and services outside the formal cash economy. Someone might mend clothing for a neighbor in exchange for watching children, or might share food with a neighbor who was hungry in expectation that the favor would be returned when circumstances reversed. These informal exchanges helped people survive when cash was unavailable and created obligations and relationships that strengthened communities. The survival strategy involved participating in these informal economies generously when one had resources to share, accepting help when needed without shame, and maintaining reciprocity so that one was not seen as always taking without giving. The balance of giving and receiving over time created trust and strengthened social bonds that were essential survival resources. The ethnic and national communities of immigrants provided particularly strong networks for survival, with Irish immigrants, Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants, and others forming communities where language, culture, and religion were shared and where mutual support was especially important. These ethnic communities would help new arrivals find housing and employment, would provide cultural continuity and identity, and would defend members against hostility from the native-born population. The survival strategy for immigrants involved settling in areas where their ethnic community was already established, participating in ethnic institutions including churches, social clubs, and businesses, maintaining cultural traditions while also adapting to English society, and using ethnic networks for practical support and social connection. The ethnic communities could be insular and could create barriers to integration, but they provided essential support that made survival possible for people who might otherwise have been completely isolated and vulnerable. Understanding and participating in social networks and communities was not optional, but was essential for survival in Victorian London. People who were isolated, who had no family or community connections, who had no one to turn to in emergencies, had dramatically reduced chances of survival. The cultivation of social networks through being helpful, through participating in community life, through joining organizations, and through maintaining reciprocal relationships was a crucial survival strategy that complemented individual effort and resourcefulness. As you finally, at long last, after this remarkably comprehensive and exhaustingly detailed exploration, drift off to sleep, you can rest knowing that you have gained complete understanding of how to survive Victorian London in all its complexity. Every aspect of survival, including finding housing, securing employment, obtaining food, avoiding disease, surviving crime, managing money, protecting children, avoiding the workhouse, enduring winter, managing daily routines, navigating the city, and building social networks, has been examined in minute and thorough detail. You now possess knowledge that would have been essential for anyone attempting to survive in this challenging urban environment during one of history's most transformative and difficult periods. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be peaceful and far from the struggles of Victorian London. Good night.